In the Yu-Gi-Oh! Duel Monsters anime, characters often mock Yugi for including Kuriboh in his deck, citing it as the weakest card in the game. But over in the actual card game, players were singing a different tune. In the real world, unbound by the D&D flavored weirdness of Duelist Kingdom, the true weakest card in the game was everyone's favorite skeleton, Skull Servant. At a glance, it makes sense that both of these cards would be considered the weakest cards in the game in its earliest years. Both are level 1 monsters with 300 attack and 200 defense, making them the weakest in terms of pure numbers, prior to the advent of 0/0 cards like Relinquished. But the key difference between the two is that Kuriboh is an effect monster, and one with a particularly useful effect for the time period at that, while Skull Servant is a normal monster, a card that does nothing. And in the absence of cards to take advantage of its unique properties, there was just no reason to ever include Skull Servant in a deck, whereas Kuriboh would actually have the potential to get you out of a jam just like it did for Yugi in the anime. Naturally, everyone loves an underdog story, and so Skull Servant, as the 3rd edition of the Yu-Gi-Oh! Master Guide puts it, earned many strange fans. He makes a number of cameo appearances in the artwork of otherwise unrelated cards, even appearing in a couple Rush Duel cards. But as the original card itself alludes to, the true power of the whites comes in numbers. And so, in 2005, while most were celebrating the start of a brand new Yu-Gi-Oh! Series, a small but loyal group would be welcoming the arrival of their king. Being a card from the first set of the GX era, King of the Skull Servants is an incredibly simple card. It gains 1000 attack for each copy of itself and the original skull in your graveyard, and because it's a zombie monster, it has a built-in revival effect. But I like to overanalyze things, and looking deeper under the surface of this card shows some really interesting design decisions. At release, the highest attack the king could have by his own effect was 5000, which to this day is still the highest static value that has been printed on a card. This meant that the previously weakest card in the game could stand on the same field as the DM filler powerhouses, 5 God Dragon and Master of Dragon Soldier. This also happens to be 1000 points higher than the starting life points in the anime, meaning it could one-shot a player with damage to spare, and would still be capable of doing it at least once if it was destroyed in battle and used its revival effect. Speaking of the revival effect, this might actually be a reference to the duel between Jonochi and Ghost Kotsuzuka in Duelist Kingdom. In this duel, Ghost's monsters all have 0 defense just like the king does, but would endlessly revive when destroyed through the effect of Call the Haunted. Jonochi is eventually able to defeat him by using shield and sword to change their attack to 0, which prevents them from being revived. King's revival effect banishes Skull Servants from the grave, consequently losing him 1000 attack in the process, and therefore, once his attack reaches 0, just like anime Call the Haunted, his revival ability no longer functions. Now, seeing as King of the Skull Servants was printed as what was essentially a joke card in 2005, it falls victim to something we call lack of future-proofing. That is, the card was not designed with the idea that additional cards would ever be made to support it as a coherent strategy. They were. In Yu-Gi-Oh!, you can only run 3 copies of a card with the same name, and King mentions itself and the original Skull Servant by name directly. This meant that all the additional white cards would need a workaround in order to serve the king, which is having their names become Skull Servant while in the graveyard. By its nature of needing to run as many whites as possible to bolster the king's attack, Skull Servant tends to lean towards being a monster mash deck, with each of the individual white monsters serving a role that would typically be found on an archetypal spell or trap card. The deck also benefits from the Zombie World package as a way of disrupting the opponent. The biggest godsend for the deck was the printing of That Grass Looks Greener, which allows the deck to very quickly and easily set up its graveyard, with the trade-off of having to run 60 cards. However, grass is currently forbidden in the TCG, and the effectiveness of the card may be mitigated as competitive decks have been trending towards higher card counts. So what does the future look like for everybody's favorite skeleton? Well, seeing as it's a joke deck by design, probably not much, given it already has better support both in and out of theme than even some modern decks. Curiously enough, the various cameos Skull Servant has made seems to suggest that the Whites have Skull Dog Marin as a family pet, so perhaps that can be an avenue for future support down the line. Perhaps something that can recover banished copies of other White cards, as Whitemare has the same lack of future-proofing problem that the King does, despite being printed years later. The original Skull Servant himself has already appeared in Rush Duel, and with so many Rush Duel cards featuring discards and mill for their effect costs, it seems like the perfect opportunity to give the deck a second life. After all, with Cyber Dragon due in the near future, putting a new spin on old Master Duel decks could give some love to the charming fellow.